So one of the first is to look at the relationship between frustration and aggression. This is often covered under the frustration-aggression theory. This theory states that frustration tends to increase the probability of any type of aggressive response, and this is especially true when the frustration is unpleasant or unwelcome or uncontrollable. Now, it has been my experience at least that most of the time frustration fits into these three categories, and I had trouble coming up with an example of where frustration could be pleasant. But maybe there's some type of puzzle that you're trying to solve and it just resists solving, and in a way that frustrates you, but you also enjoy trying to solve the puzzle and appreciate how difficult it is. And in such a case, maybe you would not be aggressive in response. Further, the degree of frustration is positively correlated with the proximity to a goal. By this, I just mean that the nearer one is to accomplishing a certain type of goal when the frustration occurs that then prevents you from achieving that goal, the higher the degree of frustration is likely to be. So your textbook mentions an experiment that was conducted where experimenters had accomplices cut in front of other people and monitor the likelihood of them making aggressive responses. And they had people either cut in front of the person who was standing second in line, or I believe 12th in line. And when they cut in front of people who were the second in line, those people tended to be much more aggressive than when it was in front of people who were 12th in line. And this just again shows how close one was to being able to finally check out. Another way of thinking about this could be that if a friend of yours turns off the power to your computer, I mean, I guess most people use laptops now, so maybe that's not as relevant, but just imagine that the power goes off of your computer and you're in the middle of writing a 12-page essay, and you are writing the first page versus you are on the 10th page of that essay. Now, assuming you haven't saved in this case, while you are most likely going to be frustrated in both of these cases, you will most likely be far more frustrated and more likely to lead to an aggressive behavior when you lose 10 pages worth of work as opposed to the single page, because the 10 pages means you are almost finished, whereas the first page you're just kind of starting off. Now, not all frustration does lead to aggression, however. So a lot of times when one talks about this, we talk about frustration leading or promoting a readiness to aggress rather than it leading directly to aggression. By that, I just mean that it makes it more likely for someone to potentially engage in an aggressive behavior, but does not necessarily guarantee an aggressive behavior. One of the main determinants that actually dictates whether this frustration will lead to an aggressive behavior or not is the surrounding context that this person finds themselves in when they are frustrated, or what are the specific situational factors that led to the frustration in the first place. So an example to conceptualize this would be, it's much easier to yell at a customer service representative who you are talking to on the phone as opposed to a customer service representative who is helping you in person. Now, a lot of this has to do with how proximately close we are to these people and how much they can then respond to us. But please note that in both of these situations, it's often not the case that a customer service representative can yell back at you, because they oftentimes want to keep their jobs. And so in both of these cases, it is completely possible for a person to aggress, though much more likely when communicating over the phone as opposed to the person helping you in person. Again, the demeanor of the person helping you in person and their size and shape and strength could also drastically change how likely one was to aggress. This is one of the reasons that we tend to find people have much more base and shall we say, violent or hurtful language when they're talking over the internet versus when they're talking to people in person. And again, this is related to this concept of, in those situations where we are removed, we feel it is easier ultimately to aggress because of a lack of ramifications, while when we're aggressing towards people who we can actually see and interact with, and who can in turn interact with us, oftentimes the possibility of reciprocation is much higher, and this will lead to a mitigation of our aggressive tendencies. This just goes to show you that regardless of the state of frustration, the situation in which that frustration occurs can dramatically impact whether or not a person is likely to aggress. Another thing to consider is that when the source of frustration is ultimately understandable or legitimate and ultimately unintentional by the person who or the thing that is frustrating you, the likelihood of aggressing in return is ultimately greatly diminished. And a lot of this occurs just because we can internally rationalize why it happened and ultimately conclude that it wasn't really someone's fault. Or even if it was their fault, there were reasons that are understandable behind it, so you can explain away that frustration, thus resolving a little bit of those feelings, which makes it less likely that that is going to lead to aggressive behaviors. Now, another factor that oftentimes gets talked about a lot when we're talking about frustration aggression theory is relative deprivation. So before getting into that, note that absolute deprivation, which is contrasted oftentimes with relative deprivation, is a fundamental lack of needs or wants. And this does not necessarily lead to anger. As can actually be seen in many places around the world, there are people who are tremendously impoverished, meaning they don't have much of even the basic necessities, but still can maintain a degree of happiness. Excuse me. And a lot of this is ultimately determined by the fact that they're all in the same boat together. It gets much more complicated when different groups of people in the same surroundings or areas or communities have different access to goods and services. And this is where relative deprivation comes in. And it is much more likely to elicit both frustration and aggression. And this is because not only does one perceive that they're entitled to certain goods and services, but they also see that other people have access to those goods and services, which makes it seem that much more unfair. And that unfairness leads to frustration, which can oftentimes lead to aggression. And this is something that oftentimes leads to great social upheaval or revolts. Another factor that comes up a lot when talking about aggression or when people are likely to behave in aggressive manners is when people are provoked. And being provoked tends to quite significantly increase the rates at which people will perform aggressive behaviors. Now, one won't always immediately resort to aggression if one has been provoked, but there are oftentimes specific situations in which that is the case. And that is when we are aware that the provocation was ultimately either unintentional or there were some mitigating circumstances that led to that provocation, and so it's less likely to be personal. Whenever these two types of things are present, the likelihood of reciprocating aggressively is greatly diminished. Now, by mitigating circumstances, I just mean things that provide alternative explanations for the provocateur's state of mind and thus ultimately the provocation. Right? So if someone has just gotten a whole bunch of horrible news, it's 115 degrees outside and they've stubbed their toe, and then they bump into you and then they call you a dick. Yeah, they were mean to you, but in many ways there's so many other things going on that them calling you a dick is relatively small in the comparison or grand scheme of things. Now, it is important to mention that in order for this to reduce the likelihood of reciprocating in an aggressive manner, one needs to be aware of these circumstances or the fact that it was unintentional. Now, that is in turn limited by one's own sort of state of mind. If you too are exhausted and it's hot and have gotten bad news, the likelihood of you paying attention to what could be going on in somebody else's mind in the context of it, as opposed to making dispositional attributions, is, well, ultimately heightened if your resources are limited, making it more likely for a person to behave aggressively. So the being aware part is very, very important there. Now, an example of this is a study conducted by Johnson and Rule in 1986. And they found that people ultimately retaliated with less intensity when the situation was explained to them beforehand, as opposed to compared to those who retaliated first and then received an explanation for the provocation. So the way this worked is they conducted a study in which you had a participant and an accomplice, and so the participant wrote a paper that was supposedly on energy consumption, I believe. They took 5 minutes to write it, And then they heard a speech by the accomplice, who they were told is participant 2. And then they were each supposed to give each other feedback. So the accomplice gave feedback on the essay they wrote, which ultimately would serve as the provocation. And then the participants were able to retaliate via sound blasts based on the performance of the accomplice. And the way that they played around with the mitigating circumstances is in that speech that the accomplice was giving, they were talking about how they performed poorly on a chemistry exam, but in one case they thought they would still do well in the class overall and not hurt their chances of getting into medical school, whereas in the other situation they were told that that low grade in the chemistry exam was going to drastically lower their grade for the whole class, and thus they would no longer be able to get into medical school. In one case, them being mean after hearing about not getting into medical school makes much more sense as to why their state of mind would be like that, whereas in the former, it's probably more of just the type of person they were, where you can't explain away the provocation as easily. Ultimately, then, what they did is they measured people's heart rates, so, excuse me, physiological arousal of the participants, along with when they retaliated with sound blasts, how loud or what was the intensity of those sound blasts. And they found that whenever they had received criticism on their paper, which they were all ultimately told that they were completely uncreative and probably not very good students, those who received that feedback before they had heard about the situation with the chemistry exam, they were much more likely to retaliate strongly, whereas those people who heard about the chemistry exam and the compromising of medical school before they got their feedback had much lower degrees of sound blast retaliation. It was also found that people's physiological arousal, as measured by their heart rate response, was much higher for those people who first got criticism than the explanation, as opposed to those who first got the explanation and then received the criticism. Basically, all of that goes to show if there is a good way to explain away why the provocation happened, we are much less likely to perform in aggressive ways. Another factor that comes up a lot when talking about aggression is something called the weapons effect. And this is the idea that there is an increase in aggression that can occur just in the mere presence of guns or other violent weapons. So one of the first studies that looked into this, even though it's been widely replicated since then, was done by Berkowitz and LePage in 1967. It was conducted using 100 undergraduate students, and these undergraduate students came into this experiment and they received either 1 or 7 shocks that were ostensibly administered by another participant who was actually an experimental accomplice, and then they were given the chance to retaliate after receiving their shocks. Now, next to the machine that they were going to use to administer the retaliatory shocks, there was either a gun sitting there, which is wild that you could have a gun sitting in an experiment, but so this gun was either there, and it was either said to be owned by the accomplice or had nothing to do with the experiment and it was just there. So these are the two weapons conditions, or in the table here you can see where it says associated weapon, meaning it was associated with the accomplice, unassociated was it was just sitting there. Another group had nothing at all other than the shock machine sitting on that table. This would be the no object. And then finally, as a control condition, they included some badminton rackets, just to make sure that it wasn't the emptiness or clutteredness of the table itself that led to differing degrees of retaliation. In this table itself, the first column here shows all those people's responses when they had only received a single shock, the column over here for when they received 7 shocks. At first glance, you can notice that when people received a high degree of shocks, their retaliation was much higher than when they received only a single shock. Now, in the condition where they received only a single shock, none of the retaliations were significantly different from each other, and so here the weapon had very little effect on their retaliation. However, when they suffered severely and then were given the opportunity to retaliate, the weapons had a significant impact on the degree of retaliation. So first of all, They administered the most retaliatory strikes when the weapon on the table sitting next to the shot machine was said to belong to the accomplice, second most for the weapon being present but not belonging to anybody. No object and badminton rackets were statistically the same or not different from one another, thus leading us to at least assume that it is the weapons that are increasing retaliation as opposed to something about the no objects there or just some other random objects. If you look more closely at this table, all of the letters basically just indicate that if the letters are the same, meaning like how all of these have A's, that just means these groups are not statistically different from each other. But any sets that have different letters, for example, this one and this one, these are statistically different from one another, meaning that weapons in the high shock condition, the retaliation between associated and unassociated weapons was not in fact significant, while the difference between no object and associated weapons was a significant difference, meaning when the associated weapon was present, people were much more likely to give more shocks and retaliation than when no shock or object was present. For the remainder of the lecture, we're going to be talking about rape and sexual assault, which can oftentimes be triggering for many people, and this is weird to do in this online format because I cannot see your faces, nor can I adequately answer questions that might come up to clarify things that I am saying. So please be aware that that is what is coming from the remainder of this lecture. If it is too triggering to listen to me talk about it, I would ultimately still recommend reading the section in the textbook because it has a large degree of valuable information. That being said, please be aware that what is coming can potentially be uncomfortable for people to talk about. So this is oftentimes something that people don't like to talk about, but we would be remiss not talking about aggression if we didn't include rape and sexual assault. So when it comes to rape, it is defined as the penetration of any bodily orifice with any object whatsoever, whether that object is part of the assailant's body or not, regardless, without the consent of the survivor. Now, this is different than sexual assault, which technically includes rape, but also encompasses a wider range of behaviors. But ultimately, all sexual assaults have in common the idea that they are perpetrated without the consent of the survivor. Now, when it comes to rape, many people still believe that the majority of such assaults take place by violent and vicious sexual predators, oftentimes like seen in movies and media. But even though this is a widely held belief, this actually only makes up a very small portion of these types of cases, about 15% of all cases reported. This is one of the reasons when people talk about people wearing scantily clad clothes and inviting rapists, that ultimately is a bullshit statement because the vast majority of rapes don't occur in those types of situations. The vast majority of them actually do take place between people who know one another. About 85% of all cases take place in this manner. What I mean by people who know one another is that people who are already in a relationship or who are married to one another. Please note that it is completely possible for rape to occur within a marriage, even though many people still don't understand this, unfortunately. Also, being married or in an otherwise committed relationship does not automatically confer consent. In the same way that just because you can get consent one time does not mean that for all the remaining times till the end of time is that consent still good. Consent needs to be repeatedly garnered because people's states of mind are continually changing. And just because someone says yes once doesn't mean that yes holds true forever. Another thing to be aware of that a lot of times people either overlook or don't talk about is that not all sexual assault is violent. Now, while it's true that any amount of violent sexual assault is too much, or I guess one could even be more specific and say that any amount of sexual assault is too much, but a lot of the time, a lot of this assault takes place when people are inebriated, and it's not necessarily inclusive of violent behaviors. Now, When people are inebriated, it impairs cognitive function. No matter what a person says about their tolerance or their ability to deal with alcohol or drugs, any amount of substance that alters the state of mind will ultimately impair cognitive performance. This has been shown repeatedly in cognitive experiments looking at the functioning of the brain. Even a single low alcohol beer is enough to begin to impair a person's brain. Adding on top of this, when we consume alcohol, the first parts of the brain to suffer impairment from that alcohol are actually the frontal cortex. The frontal cortex is largely responsible for high-level cognitive thinking, along with rationalization around the social norms and acceptable practices that we as a society have constructed. This is why when people get drunk, they oftentimes can make so many dumb decisions, because those are the parts of the brain that begin to shut down first. And they don't actually turn off, it's just that their functioning gets impaired. It is for this reason that legally a person cannot give consent when they are inebriated. Even if a person has been drinking and they're like, yes, I'm totally cool with this, legally that is not okay. Ultimately, that consent is not valid. They can wake up the next morning and freak out about the situation, and legally they are 100% entitled to do so, and just because they said yes while they were drunk the night before does not mean anything. They were taken advantage of in that situation. Okay, another thing that makes all of this that much more complicated, or at least not the cut and dry situations where you have just a direct assault, is related to something called sexual scripts. Now, sexual scripts refer to the sets of implicit rules that specify the proper sexual behavior for a person in a given situation, and these scripts change based on the person's gender, age, religion, social status, or even their peer group. Now, when people are in different ones of these groups, the chances of their sexual scripts lining up is very small, and so they're ultimately playing two different situations out in their sort of communication or interaction. One of the most common of these scripts here in the United States, even though this is seen in many parts of the world, is that a male's role is to be persistent in their advances, while it is the female's role to resist these sexual advances. And you can see how this can lead to problematic behaviors, because ultimately what we're saying here is that no isn't really no if this is how one is structured. We're going to talk about that on the next slide in more detail. Now, when you hear about no means no, it sounds really straightforward, and none of us have any trouble really. Well, maybe there's like a few people in the world, but for the most part, almost every single human being can understand this relatively straightforward concept. In fact, even young children can understand that no means no. Now, why does this still lead to so many problematic behaviors in the world today? And a lot of that is actually related to the different sexual scripts that different individuals are practicing. Now, just because we can explain why that happens, this is not in any way saying that it is okay that this happens. Ultimately, no does mean no. But understanding why and where those situations take place, where this doesn't effectively translate into behavior, is important, so we can continue to learn and thus educate other people, so we can make this more and more into practice. Now, for example, and related to the sexual script I just talked about on the previous slide, a lot of traditional male sexual scripts encode the word no as either maybe or in a little while. This is partly related to this idea of being persistent in one's advances even when one is shunned. Further, while I'm not saying all people follow this, some females follow the sexual script that goes as follows: that it is okay for them to want sex, but not to say yes to that sex too soon, else they will be labeled as a slut by their peer group. And people who are following this sexual script tend to agree with that traditional male sexual encoding of the word no as maybe or in a little while. And you can see just from that this can lead to complications in why when people say no, it is not just the end of a statement and then people can move on with their lives. In fact, a study conducted by Monson, not sure how to say, Landhinrichsen-Rolling and Binderup in 2002 conducted a survey of about 2,000 students and found out of all of these students, almost every single one of them agreed that if a female says no, a male should stop his advances. But these very same respondents, when asked if she really means no when she says no, only about 50% of them actually said that she truly means no. Meaning the other half of these people thought that when she says no, she doesn't really mean no. And you can see just in this how weird this whole situation is, because how can all of them say that people should stop when someone says no, but also half of those people think that when someone says no, it doesn't really mean no. So when you hear no, do you stop or do you keep trying? Because is that a no where I should stop, or is it a no where it's just kind of like in a little while? And it is because of this ambiguity that a lot of awkward situations can arise. And then this is even further exacerbated when you throw alcohol and drugs into the situation, because it compromises our intellectual capabilities that allow us to make sense of this very complicated situation. And just because that isn't enough, to make this even more complicated, a lot of times when we are communicating about sexual interest and desire, we do this in non-verbal ways. And this is for many reasons. One, just because we humans communicate tremendously non-verbally, but two, many of us in many cultures around the world have been socialized not to openly talk about sex and sexual interest because it's either perverse, it's not what polite people do, or it's just not okay to talk across genders about sexual interest because of, well, whatever reasons people came up with for why that's normal. But because of this being the case, and because body language can be so differently interpreted by different individuals, this further complicates this interaction across sexual dynamics between different individuals, leading to complicated ultimately outcomes where people can feel like one person took advantage of another. Now, to reduce such assaults, now when we're talking about these types of assaults, I'm talking specifically about assaults that are between acquaintances and oftentimes related to inebriation, not direct and violent assaults. The two primary ways that these can be reduced is first and foremost to ensure that both parties, or multiple parties for that matter, are following the same sexual scripts when they are interacting. This is very easy to say, and this is in fact quite difficult to do, primarily because many of these scripts are implicit, meaning they're just in us and we don't really spend much time thinking about them, and oftentimes implicit beliefs are beliefs that we also tend to expect others to follow because we follow them, and we oftentimes use ourselves as the template for how to judge the world. But please be aware, just because you are following a certain script does not mean everybody else is following that script. In fact, it's safer to assume that people are following different scripts than you. The only way that it can be resolved, or to combat the fact that people are dealing with different scripts at any given time, is through direct and open communication, which is again one of those things that is easy to say and hard to do because many of the times we're not socialized to have this type of communication. Further, it can be difficult to talk about ideals that are implicit because those are just ultimately under our conscious awareness, and so it takes effort and time to become aware of your own in a way that you can then talk about them with other people. Ultimately though, being able to talk about these things directly can save a tremendous amount of people from a lot of hurt that they do not need to go through. Second, this is something mentioned before, but ultimately it cannot be stated enough, that consent cannot be given when a person is inebriated. End of story, right? No matter what you might think about this situation or how many times you've gone to bars and all of these shenanigans, ultimately, legally speaking, it cannot be given when a person is inebriated. And ultimately, all of us can benefit from internalizing this and treating it with the respect that it is owed. But the primary onus of understanding this concept rests largely on males, just because, statistically speaking, those are the ones who conduct primarily these types of assaults.